day that I did fly a Wright Kite. And a few years later, a friend of mine, Ken Hyde, who builds and flies Wright airplanes, or tries to fly them anyway, actually gave me a Wright Kite that one of his guys had built for me, and that's what I honed my skills on. And that kite, that Wright Kite, is the one that our docents at the National Air Space Museum use with kids these days. And when you look at it, you can see all the places where I broke it and it's been repaired. So it has a lot of my history in that version of the Wright Kite. But what you're looking at here is the very first Wright flying machine. And we'll come back to that. But it's important to understand, like everybody else, and we're going to turn the clock back in a minute, the Wright started with a kite. And without having taken that first step, again, it's difficult to imagine how they could have made progress. Just to recap a little bit what Tom was talking about, kites are very ancient, at least 2,500 years old. They're embedded in cultural traditions in China, the Far East, in Southeast Asia, and in the Pacific cultures, where they're used for fishing, for ceremonial things, and all sorts of things. My big Japanese Shirone kite, which is in our collection. When people think about kites these days, they think about kites as toys, as something that children fly. And of course, children do fly them, and one of the things about kites is the pure joy that you get out of the feel of the tug on the line. I've been fascinated, really since I was in graduate school, about the links between play and advances in technology. And the kite is one example of something that, again, we regard as a plaything today, that in fact played a very serious role. The other thing is a little helicopter toy. If you look around the Bell Museum, you can see pictures of Alexander Graham Bell with some of his grandchildren with one of these little simple helicopter toys. They date back to China, like the kite. They come forward through modern Europe. And like the kite, those little toys inspired one generation after another of enthusiasts who took the steps toward the invention of the airplane. As Tom said, kites have lots of uses. He talked about the use of the kite in taking a line across the Niagara River Gorge for the first time and being used to ultimately pull heavier and heavier cables across so that the Roebling suspension bridge could be built. My friend Uli has a Gibson Girl kite with him, and you can see that kite being used for signaling and to carry radio antennas aloft and so on. Tom talked about the early contributions of kites to science and Benjamin Franklin. My predecessor at the Smithsonian, Paul Garber, developed this kite during World War II that was used for naval gunnery practice. So kites have had all kinds of uses, but the most important role that they played technologically is the role that they played in the invention of the airplane. And it all starts with this guy. Tom had showed you his picture, Sir George Cayley. He was an English baronet with a base at Brompton Hall in Yorkshire. He came of age in the late 18th century and really began to make his mark, as you can see, in the very early years of the 19th century. Everybody knows that the dream of flight is as old as human beings are. We had a question in the last session about the myth of Icarus and Daedalus, and Icarus. When you think about myths like that, what they tell you is how deep-seated that both the desire to fly is and sort of the important things that it tells you about the meaning of flight. In the case of that myth, you know, you have people who, in Ovid's terms, and in Greek terms too, are sort of trespassing on the domain of the gods, because the gods have always lived in the heavens, and the demons have always lived in the dark places under the earth. So, on the one hand, you're doing something godlike. You're trying to fly, which is something only gods can do. And on the other hand, you're trespassing on the domain of the gods. And of course, when you do that, you have to face the consequences. And in that case, of course, it's the death of Icarus. So myths like that have deep and important meanings for the history of technology. The myth of Icarus and Daedalus, you know, the two-edged sword that is technology, the positive and the danger that comes with it. Just an incredibly important myth. But my point is that going all the way back to that time, when the dream of flight is born, you really have to come to this guy to see the first serious steps being taken toward the invention of the airplane. In the 17th and the 18th century, people who were going to become called scientists eventually, people like Galileo and Newton, Daniel Bernoulli, and others, were making discoveries in fluid dynamics that were going to be very important to the invention of the airplane. But none of those guys were interested in flight. They were doing this for other, more practical reasons. A fellow named John Smeaton, an 18th century Englishman who really can be defined as one of the first generations of men who actually called themselves engineers as opposed to scientists, was doing fluid dynamic work looking at windmill blades and water wheel blades and testing efficiencies and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of important work being done, but it isn't until you get to Cayley that you have a guy who's able to reach back into those 17th and 18th century studies and pull out what's useful to him in terms of aeronautics. So he's not only the first engineer who's doing literature research to discover useful bits of information from the past, but he's also the first guy who's applying that information to the design of airplanes. Tom showed you this little silver disc, and literally it's only about that size. It's in the Science Museum in London, 1799, but you can see on this side, marked 1799, what really is the first modern drawing of what we'll come to call an airplane. And that's because it has all of the systems that an airplane has to have. It has a wing for lift, it has control devices back here on the back, and it's a glider, so gravity is the propulsion system. So lift, propulsion, and control are all there. And on the back of that disc, he has done this little bit of trigonometry that talks about the forces operating on an object in a fluid stream. So, just an extraordinary guy. He also conducts his own research on the principles of flight, gathering data. And in 1804, just 5 years after he had this original breakthrough, he built and flew that. And that is the world's first model airplane, the world's first successful model airplane. And if you look, as Tom told you, and here's a model that we have in the museum, the wing is a kite. It's an arch-top kite, which is the only kind of wing George Cayley could imagine. And so you have a kite connected with this very first successful step toward a flying machine. George Cayley, just a few years later really, published an important three-part paper in the Mechanics magazine on his approach to flying machines. And from that point to the time of his death in the middle of the 19th century, he devises one flying machine after another. Some of them are only designed on paper. At least 3 of them he actually built and flew. We don't actually have good records of the flight. And there are people, I think, who regard them as mythic as Icarus and Daedalus, because the best accounts we have of Cayley's flights are secondhand, and in fact done some years after the fact. But they have such a ring of truth to them that I'm sure in my heart of hearts they're true. This picture, in fact, is a version of this Cayley design being built and flown by a famous English glider pilot, Derek Pickett, whom I think both Paul and I know or knew, at any rate, demonstrating, and again, it's so simple, you can see Derek hasn't strayed from this drawing in any way, and there it is, being towed, like a kite. And of course, the wing is a kite, and in later drawings, you can see the same thing. Here is something that even, has the beginning elements of a cellular kite, like a Hargrave box kite from a much later period. Cayley actually sent, probably, a couple of people into the air, one a young boy, and ultimately the most famous is Coachman. And there's an apocryphal story, I don't know whether it's true or not, it ought to be true if it's not, that Cayley talked his coachman, the guy who drove his coach on the ground, into making a flight across the valley at Rompton in this machine. And at the end of it, the coachman could walk away, but he's reputed to have gone up to Cayley and quit, resigned, saying that he'd been hired to drive, not to fly. So whether it's true or not, it should be. As you move through the 19th century, again, the kite is the only lifting device, the only wing design that most of these people can imagine. This is Thomas Moy, another Englishman, 1879. He even calls it the military kite, although it's quite small. You can hold it in your hand. It's powered by rubber strands. It's on wheels, as you can see. It's probably the first model that ever lifted from the ground under its own power. And he not only calls it a military kite, clearly it has a kite wing with what we know as dihedral. The wings are sort of angled up from the root, from the fuselage, and that demonstrates something else that people got from kites, a notion of how to make a flying machine stable, or more stable than it is. When you add dihedral to the wings of a flying machine, whether it's a model like this or a full-scale glider, you give yourself some stability, some lateral stability, some stability and roll. If you're struck by a wind and you begin to go like this, as the wing becomes more horizontal, it becomes more efficient. It actually develops more lift and will automatically tend to return the airplane to a balanced state. Something that the Frenchman, Alphonse Pinot, pioneered, and experimenters like Moy, a little later in the 19th century, were making use of. George Pocock, again, is one of these guys, Tom mentioned him, who develops the cher-volant and is putting the power of the kite to work to pull his chariot. In America, a lot of this kite work becomes really important. Tom also mentioned William Eddy, this fellow, and this is, in fact, the world's oldest Eddy kite, which is in our collection, the oldest known Eddy kite. Eddy kites are bowed kites, so you get the same kind of dihedral effect from them that Moy got with his little powered model. So you can fly it, essentially, without a tail, and it's not only stable, but it's developing a little more lift. So it's another case in which a kite is being used for some direct experiments, demonstrations, in aerodynamics and in stability as well. And Eddy kites were the first ones that were being used meteorologically. I'm going to go ahead to this, and then I'll come back. The Blue Hill Observatory, we heard about a second ago, still there in Blue Hill, Massachusetts, in fact, outside Boston. In fact, this is a picture that I took of it the last time I was up there. It was founded by this fellow, Abbott Lawrence Rutch. He was a Harvard man. In fact, at that time, the Blue Hill Observatory was part of Harvard University. It became independent later, but at that time it was Harvard's meteorological place. Not only did Rutch begin to use eddy kites, big ones, to lift meteorological instruments, but he made that leap from the kites to the airplanes as well. He was one of the founders of something called the Boston Aeronautical Society. One of the really interesting things that you see happening in the 1880s and 1890s is that people all over the world, serious people, are becoming interested in flying machines. I think those of us today, looking back at then tend to think that most people at that time thought the flying machine business was just craziness. You know, if God wanted us to fly, he would have given us wings. But in fact, if you look at the literature, what's happening is that the people who are closest to the problems that stand between them and success with a flying machine are not scientists at all. They're engineers. Engineers are people who apply data to the solution of a particular problem. And engineers became professional engineers as they were developing as a profession, became fascinated by flight very early on. The first presidential lecture ever given to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers was not on steam engines or some traditional topic. It was on flying machines in the 1880s. So engineers are taking this very seriously. And Rutch and his friends in Boston create one of these early aeronautical societies, and they're building gliders, they're experimenting with kites, and they really play an important role as people take those last steps toward the invention of the airplane. So Rutch and his friends, using their kites to loft meteorological instruments, are really important. Now we'll go back to Lawrence Hargrave. A neat-looking guy, probably handsomer by our standards without the beard, but an extraordinary guy. An Englishman who lived in Australia and did his most important work in Australia and felt extraordinarily isolated, in fact, in Australia. He would write to English and American colleagues just complaining all the time about the fact that he was isolated down there, nobody to talk to, and all of his aeronautical friends were in what was to him the far corners of the world. He took a lot of important steps aeronautically, but the most important thing that he did was to develop cellular kites in a way no one else quite had. And when it comes to the link between kites and airplanes, there is no more important kite than the Hargrave box kite, the Hargrave cellular kite. The reason is partially aerodynamic. You have a fairly lightweight kite with a lot of surface area, so it's pretty efficient in terms of flying for its weight. But really more important than that, and what drew a lot of experimenters to the Hargrave kite, was the structure. This box kite structure essentially creates a huge beam structure, like a bridge. Braced pieces of wood, wires holding everything together, so that you can hit this kind of a structure with a Mack truck and it won't break. And a lot of engineers looked at that and thought, okay, that's the way to go. Our structural problem, at least building an airplane that won't fall apart, is on its way to a solution thanks to Lawrence Hargrave. People were beginning to fly kites in trains as well, and this is Hargrave, a little older, and a slightly different version of the Hargrave cellular kite. But again, as early as 1894, he was lifting himself into the air with kite trains, as you see here. And the Americans and European meteorological observatories picked up on that really quickly too, and developed formula that would enable them to know when they had to add kites and when the addition of a kite would be inefficient and all that. They used, at least the professionals at Blue Hill and European meteorological observatories, they would use steam winches for these kites. The kind of thing that the Englishman, William Thomson, had developed for deep sea dredging and that kind of thing. They would turn that technology on its head and use them to operate these huge kite trains. And very quickly, you came to people like these folks who were not Blue Hill guys. These folks were with the United States Weather Bureau. Very early on in the 20th century, the Weather Bureau established 27 kite stations all across the country where they would lift meteorographs like this, developed by this guy, Charles Marvin, that would take a variety of meteorological readings. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, starting at Blue Hill and then moving to Weather Bureau sites, there was this competition to reach what were for them extreme altitudes, under 20,000 feet. But still, they kept going higher and higher, using kite trains and moving really quickly from eddy kites, where they'd begun, to using standard Hargrave kites and then specialized Weather Bureau kites of that sort. They're clearly based on Hargrave's design, but a little bigger and a little more efficient. This is a Marvin kite in the collection of the National Air Space Museum. Willis Moore is there. He was a kite guy as well with the Weather Bureau. And it so happens that in 1900, Willis Moore got a letter from two guys running a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, asking him about average winds all over the United States. And they were, of course, the Wright Brothers. And Willis Moore's answer to the Wright Brothers is what enabled them to pick the spot where they were going to conduct their experiments, as we'll see. Just a variety of successful and unsuccessful Weather Bureau tests, all based on Hargrave's cellular principle, some of them using round cells like this. And this, of course, is what becomes the Marvin meteorological kite, the one that's most successful and was used in this country well into the 20th century. And again, the link here is that all of these guys, Marvin, Willis Moore, they were not only conducting meteorological experiments, they were interested in aviation as well, and using the data that they had developed with their kite designs to move toward the area of heavier than air powered flight. And some of them, Roach, for example, whom I mentioned, wrote a very famous early book on aviation. And one of his colleagues, James Howard Means, in the Boston Aeronautical Society, another kite man, edited a very famous aeronautical journal in the late 19th century, the Aeronautical Annual. So these guys, while they're building and flying their kites and gathering meteorological data, they're all thinking about aviation as well. I've been doing a lot of things with Civil War ballooning over the past few months because it's the 150th anniversary of the beginning of the use of the observation balloon during the Civil War. And what I tell people is that the Union Army Balloon Corps was the first military aeronautical unit in American history, and that's true. But the Balloon Corps during the Civil War was run by the topographical engineers. The Signal Corps, where aviation was ultimately going to be based, got into the airplane business in the period 1894-1897, as you see up there. And this is a story that is not as well known as it probably should be. General James Allen, the guy with the neat mustache up there, was the chief signal officer at Governor's Island in New York Harbor in the late 1890s. And this guy, Hugh Wise, who was a lieutenant then, he was a colonel when he retired many years later, was one of the young enthusiastic Signal Corps officers. Alan one day ran across an article on the heart rate kite in an engineering journal. And he came to Wise and he said, you know, this looks like something that ought to be useful to us in one way or another. So Wise launches into a series of experiments with big heart rate kites, really big ones. This is the frame uncovered of one of Wise's early kites. From the beginning, Wise is saying to himself, well, you know, we could carry cameras aloft with these things and do aerial reconnaissance with cameras. We could even take people and take them up and do aerial reconnaissance. And so these experiments with human lifting kites are taking place at Governor's Island in the closing years of the 19th century. Here they're conducting experiments with signal flags. The Army budget being what the Army budget always is, they didn't have a lot of money for these things. So the presidential election in 1896, a New York newspaper, knowing about the kite work at Governor's Island, came to these guys and gave them a pile of money to build really big kites and lift election results into the air on election eve. And it was with that money that Wise continued his work. Jimmy here was their first human passenger. He wasn't human at all. He was an Army uniform stuffed with straw and weighted so that he approximated the weight of a human being. Anyway, and that's how Wise began his human lifting experiments. This is an illustration of his first trip aloft, which, as you might gather from the look on his face, didn't go all that well. But he continued the experiments. The Army actually, with the approach of 1898, got Wise to take his kite down to Tampa, Florida, where they were preparing the invasion force that was going to go down to Cuba, and had Wise actually conducting reconnaissance experiments, not with a human being, but with cameras, to see if he could spot the Spanish fleet, to see if they were in Havana Harbor or not. And these kites continued being used in later years, into the early years of the 20th century, as Uli probably knows, to carry radio antennas aloft. In fact, before the First World War, Billy Mitchell, who of course commands American air units in France in combat during World War I, was a signal officer in Alaska and used Wise kites to carry an antenna, radio antenna, wireless antenna, up to a record altitude and actually picked up ships from, signals from a ship at sea over 1,000 miles out. So, and in fact, later years, Mitchell actually looked back at these experiments and said, this is really where the American Air Force began. And there's a direct link between these experiments and flight. Is one day with an eddy kite, one of those plane surface eddy kites that I showed you before, a very big one. Wise was up on a hill like this one, and they were getting ready to launch the kite. He was holding it like this, and he was struck by a gust from the front, started to go over backwards, and he was afraid he would fall on the kite and break it. So with his hands, he tipped the nose down and just went off the brow of the hill. And he glided close to 400 feet down the hill, just that way, holding onto the kite. And that led him to these kinds of experiments. He actually had kind of a zany way to launch himself. He went from those kind of experiments to building this thing, which he flew multiple times in 1897. believe it or not, you can see this thing. You can't tell what it is. It's a bicycle. What he would do would be he'd go to the brow of a hill with a guy on each wingtip kind of steadying him, and he would run downhill with a bike. And when he felt he had airspeed, he'd lift off the bike and go on down the hill. So he was really quite an extraordinarily important guy, but almost entirely forgotten, but important in terms of military aeronautics. Other people around the world were doing kite observation experiments too. Most famously, DFS Baden-Powell in England, the brother of Robert Baden-Powell, the founder of the Boy Scouts, he was president of the Aeronautical Society of Great Britain and conducting these kinds of kite observation tests. They figured that when you take an observation balloon into the field, you have to inflate it, and it's a lot of hassle and all that. Wouldn't it be simpler if you could do it with kites? The kites never worked as well as the balloons, but the experiments, again, contributed to aviation, to the invention of the airplane. As I said, Baden-Powell was the president of the Aeronautical Society of Great Britain. So right at the core of where important work was being done. This guy is someone I've written about a lot. This, in fact, is known as the Shakespeare portrait. He was a friend of Bell and a friend of Samuel Langley's, Octave Chanute. French-born, came to this country at the age of 6 and rose to become probably the most notable American civil engineer of the last decade of the 19th century. A bridge builder, a railroad builder, and a guy who was absolutely fascinated by flying machines. And like so many of these guys, he came to it by way of kites. This is the ladder kite that Chanute's working with. I dated this one in 1896, but his experiments with these ladder kites actually go back to the early 1890s. In fact, he may have developed what we could regard as a useful cellular kite, even before Hargreave did. But when Hargreave comes along, Chanute immediately recognizes the virtue of Hargreaves' kite and begins marrying his ideas with Hargreaves. And you can see one of his ladder kites in the air here. You can see the links to Hargreaves, but you can see what's specifically Chanute as well. And he goes from that to things like this. This is a glider that he tested on the Indiana Dunes east of Chicago in 1896, the summer of 1896, called the Katydid, because he thought it looked kind of like a bug, as I guess it does. But again, clearly points right back to the kite experiments. This is Augustus Moore Herring, one of the young engineers, a graduate of the Stevens Institute, whom Chanute hired to help him out, and who Samuel Langley hires a little bit later to help him out. But again, Herring is one of these guys who begins with kite experiments and moves to powered models like this one, again, clearly kite-based, and they wind up with this. This is the Chanute, what he called the two-surface machine of 1896. When you look at it, you can see the Hargreave kite in there. It's the most successful flying machine between the time of Otto Lilienthal, who's killed in August of 1896, and the Wright Brothers, who began their work in 1900. And it's in fact this design, based on the Hargreave box kite, that inspires the Wright's basic notion of the structure of an airplane. Samuel Langley, who was the third secretary of the Smithsonian, and who, in May of 1896, flies this thing, wingspan of about 14 feet, powered by a steam engine that you see in there. It actually makes flights of up to 3/4 of a mile over the Potomac. It's being launched from the roof of a houseboat there. At the time, Alexander Graham Bell and Langley were BFFs, as my granddaughter says, best friends forever. In fact, when you go to the deck, Langley's signature is the first signature in the guest book at the deck. Because again, Bell was the chairman of the Board of Regents, which was responsible for the operation of the institution and hiring, firing Langley and so on. But the point is, Langley began his work with kites as well and used them all during his operations. These are Langley kites from our collection, but when you look at them, clearly they have the Bell influence as well. And you can see the two of them getting together. In fact, unless I'm mistaken, Bell took this picture. Bell was there on the day that first flight was made. And in fact, wrote perhaps the best account of what that flight was like. And again, documented it with his own photographs. Other man lifters, as you move through the late 19th century, I've got a typo down there. This is Charles Henry Lamson, as I said. He develops, like these other guys in America and England, these large cellular kites. Here's his patent drawing, and transforms them into man-lifting kites. That's essentially this machine in the air with a human being on board. And not always Lamson himself. I love this illustration. It's from an American newspaper, and what happened was that a girl reporter, you know, it was the age of Nellie Bly, when young girl reporters in frilly dresses and so on got a lot of copy space in American newspapers. She showed up at Lamson's testing ground and made a flight. And you can see this is a pretty big and formidable looking machine, a man lifter. In fact, Lamson later in 1897 1901 builds a glider that is actually tested at the Wright Brothers camp in Kitty Hawk. And he ultimately, in fact, sues the Wright Brothers, claiming that they got their ideas from him, which was nonsense, as the court recognized. But still, he's one of these guys who's fiddling around with man and woman carrying kites of considerable size. Not only are kites used for aerodynamic testing, lift, and structural work, and so on, like Lamson, this is kind of a neat and difficult to understand cellular Hargrave kite that Hugh Wise, the Army officer I talked about, developed. It has these little flaps on the trailing edge of the rear cell of the kite. And they aren't ailerons, but in fact it's an elevator that he uses to help control the angle and that kind of thing of the kite, at least in an experimental way. Another pioneering kite, just before the Wrights come along, Edson Fessenden Gallaudet, from the famous Washington Gallaudets, and again, another Bell connection, because the Gallaudets, like Bell, were not only connected, but they were interested in the education of the deaf and that kind of thing. Edson was the engineer in the bunch, and in 1898, he's teaching physics at Yale, and he develops this kite, which is in our collection. It's on floats, as you can see, and it's actually what we call a wing warping kite, which is the same approach the Wright brothers used to flight control. If you're flying along like this and you're struck by a gust, Gallaudet has a way to change the angle of attack on either wing so that you can control the airplane. If you're flying along, you're struck by a gust like this, he can reduce the angle of attack on this wing, increase it on this wing. So he's increasing the lift over here and decreasing it over here, and so he can balance the airplane again. So kind of an extraordinary link between kites and flying machines. But these guys, just to conclude, of course, are the ones that make most successful use of kites as they take the final steps toward the invention of the airplane. Wilbur Wright, on your right over there, is the older brother. He's 4 years older than his younger brother Wilbur. Orville was born in 1867. Wilbur in Wilbur in 1867. Orville in 1871. And they're the sons of a minister in the United Brethren in Christ Church who rises to the rank of bishop ultimately. If you had known the Wrights in 1898, 1899, when they're becoming interested in flight, you would have regarded them as nice guys, good family men. Neither of them ever married, but they were very close to their father, their sister, and so on. Good small businessmen, honest as the day is long, but you would never have picked them out as two guys who were going to change the world. But in fact, that's exactly what happened. As you get into 1896, 1897, Wilbur, especially the older brother, begins to feel that he's over 30 now, and he's living in his father's house. Neither one of them ever married. He's in a business with his younger brother. Together, they're running the 14th largest bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. Truly a small business. And so he's beginning to think, gosh, there ought to be a challenge against which I can measure myself. And it comes with the airplane. It's a process that fascinates him. And so in 1896, out of Lilienthal, a German experimenter is killed in a glider crash. And the brothers decide they're going to step in and see what they can contribute to the solution of the problem. These guys, neither of whom went to college, were just intuitive engineers. And as they looked at the problem, they said to themselves, you know, a flying machine is going to be a complex machine that has 3 different systems. You're going to have wings to lift you into the air. You're going to have power to move you forward through the air, and you're going to have a way to control the thing when you're in the air. Well, they thought about Lilienthal and Langley and the kite builders, all of whom had actually left the ground, and so they said to themselves, you know, people must know an awful lot about wing design, so we'll use data that comes from those guys to design our wings, and for the moment, we won't worry too much about that. Structure? Well, the heart rate box kite is a really good structural design. It takes a lot of punishment without breaking, so we'll go with that. And that left the problem of control. Otto Lilienthal had been killed in 1896 because he could not control his glider. Percy Pilcher in England had been killed in 1899, same thing. So the Wrights say to themselves, okay, first thing we do is figure out how to control this thing, then we'll build it. And they came up with a way of altering the geometry of the wing so that they could maintain absolute control of everything. And they tested it with the kite that, again, you see in the picture. So the Wrights begin with a kite. This is a sort of drawing of that 1899 kite that shows you how it works. These are the sticks down here. 20-foot lines to the leading edges, top and bottom. When you push both of your thumbs forward, that top wing goes back, bottom wing comes forward, and you pitch up. When you pull both of your thumbs back like this, top wing comes forward, bottom wing goes down, you pitch down. But when you oppose your thumbs, as you see here, you put that helical twist across the wing, and that's how you control it and roll. Again, if you're struck by a gust and this starts to happen, decrease the lift here, increase it here, and that's the first step toward the Wright Brothers' invention of the airplane. Another friend of mine in Kitty Hawk was another model of the Wright Kite, which is only about 5 feet across. Kitty Hawk, as it was, again, the Wrights Once they were confident they could control the machine, they did write to the Weather Bureau, to Willis Moore. Moore writes back, telling them, giving them a list of the places in the U.S. with strong, steady winds. Most of the windy places were what you'd expect, cities on coasts like Buffalo and Chicago, San Francisco. The sixth windiest place was this little fishing village nobody had ever heard of, Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. The brothers didn't want the newspapers paying any attention to them, so Kitty Hawk it was. When they got down with their first kite glider, the Wrights actually were going to do what the other folks had done. Initially, they were going to learn to fly by flying a kite. They figured if they were tethered, they could learn to control the thing and so on. They discovered almost immediately that that wasn't going to work. So they went from kites to gliders immediately. And what they discovered that first year was that, again, as engineers, these guys wanted to calculate everything they could about their machine before they built it, so they would understand a little something about performance before they built it. So they used a fairly simple algebraic formula and data that they had inherited from their predecessors to figure the wing area that they needed to get the weight of the glider and the weight of the pilot into the air. And when they got down to Kitty Hawk, they discovered they were about 30% off. And they couldn't actually fly it as a glider with somebody on board. I suppose a lot of people would have thrown the thing in the ocean and gone fishing, which they love to do. Instead, what the Wrights did was to instrument their glider and flew it as a kite with a fish scale on it so they could get the total force and a way to measure the angle of attack and an anemometer to give them the wind speed. They could calculate how much lift this thing was actually producing. And so begin to solve the wing design problem that they hadn't known existed. This is Tom Tate. Again, that first year, the glider produced too little lift to get into the air for them. So they put Tom Tate, who was 12 years old, on the glider and flew it as a kite. So this kid was the first person ever to fly in a Wright glider. And the Wrights constantly flew their gliders as kites, gathering data. Here they are with the next year, 1900, flying it again as a kite. Here's a crummy photograph. It isn't a Wright photograph. It's one that Octave Chanute took, and it just isn't very clear. But again, they're flying it as a kite, trying to figure out how much lift and drag this thing is producing. Another Chanute photo with the 1901, just to show you how often they flew these things as kites. So they began to gather data to correct misunderstandings about wing design by flying the gliders as kites and measuring the forces operating on them. By 1901, they decided to actually just dump the data they had received from their predecessors and build the first wind tunnel. They didn't invent the wind tunnel. Francis Herbert Wyndham did in 1871. But their first wind tunnel, and more important than the wind tunnel, which is just a box with a fan on it, was the first sensible wind tunnel balance. This is the thing that actually gives you the data from the wind tunnel. You can hold this thing in the palm of your hand. It's made out of old hacksaw blades, bicycle spoke wire, and just as simple as you can imagine. And that's the surface that's being tested. The wing's coming this way toward you, and of course that wing is going to move, demonstrating its lift. And you read that down here. And the beauty of this thing is that off this little scale down here is going to pop a number that you can use to calculate something engineers call the coefficient of lift with this balance and the coefficient of drag with another balance. And they use that information to go ahead and design their 1902 glider, which is in effect the world's first airplane. It's unpowered, but it's the first of their airplanes that behaved as the calculations had predicted. And again, here they are flying it as a kite. So time after time, the use of the gliders flown as kites to gather hard data is what leads to this moment, December 17th, 1903, when they make 4 flights, the longest of which is a little short of 900 feet in 59 seconds. And so after ages of dreaming and 100 years of engineering work, powered flight has arrived. People continue to use kites after the Wright brothers to get into the air themselves. Israel Ludlow, 1905. This is the famous Voisin Archdeck float glider on the Seine in Paris in 1905, designed and built by Gabriel Voisin, the famous French designer. Alberto Santos Dumont and his 14 Beasts, the first airplane to make a public flight in Europe in the fall of 1906. And again, you can see the Hargrave impact on Santos Dumont. You're going to hear more about Samuel Franklin Cody tomorrow, but Cody obviously begins with kites as well and moves forward to the first powered flying machine operated in Great Britain, the very first in 1908. And finally, we come down to Alexander Graham Bell. Bell, who was of course aware of the Wrights and in touch and so on, thought that what the Wrights were doing was probably a little dangerous, traveling through the air at the speeds they were traveling. Bell said, why not travel more slowly with an airplane that has a lower wing loading, that is, lower weight for lift ratio than what the Wright airplane had. And he reasoned that a kite, a tetrahedral kite, especially efficient, was the way to approach that. And so here in Badek, the Aerial Experiment Association runs through all of these experiments with kites and ultimately powered kites, leading ultimately to the flights of Red Wing, White Wing, the June bug seen here at Hammondsport in July of 1908, and then finally, of course, Silver Dart, which made the first flight here in Canada. So, I've run a little over, but that's all I have to say. So, thank you for listening. Yes?
I've always wondered something. When I still remember the first time I learned about flight, I was in a science class at school. We were told the wing was curved, and that meant the air above it had to go faster, and therefore there was less pressure above the wing. And yet all these things have flat surface wings.
Not all of them. Beginning with John Smeaton, in fact, in the 18th century, when Smeaton looked at windmill blades and water wheel blades, he was the first to suggest that what came to be called a cambered surface or a curved surface was going to be more efficient than a flat plate. And Daniel Bernoulli, as you suggest, in the 18th century explains why that's the case. So while a lot of these wings, the kite wings are obviously flat mostly, but the airplane wings are cambered. They're just, as the Wright said in their patent, they use the phrase essentially flat. And by that, what they mean is, yeah, the wing looks flat. It's actually cambered or curved, but it looks like a...
But it could fly if it weren't curved, right?
Well, as Hap Arnold once said, you can fly a barn door if you have enough power. Paul?
Just come back to that. Sorry, I've got a sore throat. I'm giving a talk tomorrow, so you won't hear anything. But I'm trained as an aerodynamicist, and I've looked at this flat plates against curved surfaces. Actually, when kites fly, the sails billow, so you do get a natural shape. It's not very good.
And that's what Cayley got, yeah, for example.
But the real thing with these early aeroplanes is they didn't fly very fast. And the aerodynamics of the low-speed aerodynamics tends to favour flat surfaces. You don't get any benefit by having an airliner wing at those speeds. They only come in much later. So,
as Paul suggested, the speeds the Wrights are operating, for example, the aerodynamic conditions are really quite different from what you're going to encounter just a few years later when you're flying at 100 miles an hour.
we're talking about flying speeds, about 25 to 30 miles an hour,
Right.
which is compared with takeoff speeds of the jumbo jet, which is about 120 miles an hour. There's a huge amount of difference in aerodynamics between the two. So flat plates are not that bad, really, for these low speed airplanes.
Maybe by the
When Langley conducted his test, he tested flat surfaces as a comparative measure to camera surfaces. Yes, sir.
Yeah, years ago, there was an article in one of the magazines on something called a solar kite. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not, but it was something, it was a kite they got up there with this great thing, it was operated with on solar pressure. In other words, the pressure from the sun operated this huge kite that was up there. You ever write anything like that? Or articles on that?
People have talked about using solar sails, but in space, not inside the atmosphere. They've talked about using the pressure of that solar pressure with objects in large flat surfaces in space.
It seemed to be operated by the sun. You'd have to have a tremendous sail area to move something like that.
Well, you do. And again, in space, where you're not going to fall down, you can allow the forces to build up until, incrementally slower, you eventually reach very high speeds that way.
I'm going to jump in for a moment because there's always a need to stay on schedule.
Right.
George, who was organizing the kiters, which is a lot like herding cats, has asked me to step in for a moment because he and Uli are doing some interviews with the media. And Sally Shankman from the Bell family, it's my honor to ask you to come forward.
And you know what's in the box?
It's so fabulous.
Happy to give this to you.
Oh, thank
It's your
you.
very own.
What an honor.
There it is. And it is special.
Indeed it is. In fact, I am going to, well, I'll do that later.
For those of you in the audience who don't know what's in the box of oil, it is a Bell tetrahedral cell, an original from the Bell Kite House. And it appears as though if we all do a good job, we may all be getting one of these. The pressure is on for those of us who are yet to follow. So,
I've signed this.
if any of you from the audience would like to see this up close, this is an opportunity because these are very elegant structures. Yeah, it's a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Thank you.
We'll strap it into the back like it was our grandchildren.
We will
You can
indeed.
do that. You can do that. It's a lovely book.
That
It
is
is
amazing.
You are so welcome.
On my long journey home for 1,000 miles.
Give him a hug, Sally.
Give him a hug.
To Yellow Springs
Give him
Club.
a- Yes, that's right. Trees.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Get up here, but I was trying to.
I'm glad. Oh, wait.
Your patience.
I have a mathematician.
What a fabulous facility with fabulous collection. Connection.
No, wherever.
Is it really?
Can you imagine?
Thank you.
See you people in the Bell thing, oh my God. We'll do our best. We'll do
Oh,
our
they are?
Well, we'll try it.
And, but in fact, Francis Regalis, supposed to be aerodynamic, because the national flying university for many years is the guy who developed the Regalis wing. You know, the wing they use for hang gliding. So that late. Thank you.
And then we would meet again on Monday and I would give it back. And we did that for our summer. So I have been going to Hanford for years, but so I
Took
knew.
one too long.
The ultimate. The amazing thing are the connectors at the corners. In
They
my
are.
presentation, I don't, and in a large picture, they were, so.
When we were kids, the next stage, we were we had all these aluminum balls with all these sticks sticking out.
Isn't that something?
Tinker toys, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Bob, do you know she went to college from Wright Brothers?
No kidding. Well, I sat in her house in 2009 in the evening.
House here.
Here.
It was, not three, it was a constellation. You know, the perfect tails, Lockheed, slightly later, at Wright Field. Oh, what? It was the last time he ever held a control on an airplane. 2 years before that. Exactly. Exactly.
My grandmother inherited a big house. She lived in it for 9 kids. There's this six. We got the first one.
They're tetra-like. Well, they're tetra-heat. Yeah.
Ah,
You work with their land and
So anyway, when you're over there, you
I'm gonna get this out, so you.
In those days, it was
how many flights do you have?